Hey everyone, welcome back to Tallulah Talks. That is me. And today is Saturday, which means it is time for Saturday's Haunting Hour. So I had never really heard of this story before. And basically it is about a young woman who had, she believed to have had a curse put on her. So slightly different to what we would usually talk about, because we've talked about hauntings, poltergeists, exorcisms and things like that. So this is a haunting, but it kind of begins with a curse. So we are going to focus on, I believe she was a socialite, Pat Montandon. So, excuse me, book of stories, let's get started. So the story begins with Pat Montandon, and she was born in Oklahoma. And she later in her life launched a fashion career, but she did quite a lot. She was also a writer. I think she was on, she had her own talk show. And she then came to San Francisco to be a journalist and, like I just said, a talk show host. So she had quite a lot going on. By 1960, she was known as a socialite, and she mingled with the best of the best. And I'm sure she mingled with the likes of like Frank Sinatra and things. I'm not sure how she got into that card. It might have been her career, but it was said she mixed with the best of the best. And the story takes place on Lombard Street. In 1967, she hosted an astrology-themed party, and she was known to hold really big events like this. She was working on her novel at the same time about being this party girl. And her parties were, it said it was mostly attended by the elite, the best of the best, very higher up people in society. Her apartment on Lombard Street, that was like a well-known area. I think it's known as like the most crooked street in San Francisco. And there was always kind of like this layer of fog surrounding the buildings. And at this time, there were killers about at this time, especially Manson. I was going to say Marilyn Manson, but no. Charles Manson. I always get those two mixed up. One is in music and is known to have done a lot of things, and the other is a cult leader. So yeah, and the Zodiac Killer. So at this astrology party, this is where things really began to take a turn for Pat. One of the attractions that she had there was a tarot reader, and he was said to have been behaving very bizarrely at this party. Now, I'm not sure what happened. I don't know if like an argument broke out, or if she maybe just asked him to leave because he was acting so strangely. But it was said that he stormed out of the house while also shouting a curse at Pat and over her home. It was after this that things really started to go quite badly for Pat. So soon after this, a series of paranormal events occurred, and it was said that Pat would hear laughter and faint music coming from around the house, but she could never find the source of this. She always heard the noises coming from inside her home, and it would happen on repeat. She would feel gushes of wind, just random gushes of wind within the house, even though the doors and windows were locked. And she would also hear a disembodied footsteps walking around her house. And again, she could not find the source of these. At this time, it is said that Pat felt very uneasy and that she did feel some kind of presence in her home. It is reported that fires would mysteriously start, like they couldn't find the source of how the fires began, and bad luck just followed her around, and she believed this was because of the tarot reader, because previously her life had been amazing. You know, she was a talk show host, she was working on a book, she was a socialite, she mixed with a lot of celebrities. Her apartment shortly after had a series of robberies, um, and it was kind of like these criminals were lurking around every corner, and she had never had these problems before. She did write a book on her experiences, and she states that her home had become a very dreary place to live, and bad things continued to happen. She was a victim of prank calls. She did have a car crash at one point where, after this crash, her car was then vandalized and then stolen. But obviously, bad things happen to everyone. But I mean, that is just a series of bad luck. On one occasion, she found blood dripping from the ceiling, and this then brought the emergency services to her door. I don't know whether they found the source of this. It never said that like anything had happened in the apartment above, so I'm not sure where that would have come from because it never said. At this point, Pat decided to hire security because she felt she was in danger. And her dog was actually so spooked by everything happening around the house that she had to give her dog to a friend temporarily. She, at this time, was also abused by various men and blamed this on the curse. She was stalked, harassed, and sexually abused by people she would like go on dates with, and that had never happened to her before. Her career also began to suffer as a result, and she developed quite a lot of illnesses during this time as well. She developed pneumonia, and I think when she was taking her prescription, she accidentally overdosed. There is some speculation that like she meant to kill herself, but I don't think that's the case. June 22nd, 1969, Pat's best friend, Mary Lou, died in Pat's apartment. So what had happened is Pat had moved out of the apartment for, I don't know, just maybe for her safety and because she was spooked by what was going on. And her friend at the time was looking for somewhere to stay, so Pat let her live in her apartment. So she was staying there, and sometime during the night, Mary Lou Ward died lying face down in the bed. And so obviously emergency services were called, and they had found that a mysterious fire had burned through the flat. And according to the coroner, Ward actually died before this fire began. There was no smoke in her lungs. There was no like carbon monoxide. I think her feet were burned, but that's just not how she died. There were no drugs in her system, and there was only one glass of wine which she had had that night. Investigators had come in and blamed faulty wiring for the fire. However, they did not ever find a cause for Mary Lou's death, which is quite scary because that could have been Pat Montandon, and unfortunately it was a friend. The fire inspector reportedly said that it looked like Ward had died of fright. So it was like she had maybe seen something and her heart just stopped. Pat then began looking into the history of the house and found that the flat was a previous site of hangings. There have also been many suicides in this flat, which were all women, and years and years previous to Pat moving in, a woman had killed herself in the downstairs apartment. Two of Pat's friends, Vera and Carolyn, who had spent a lot of time in the apartment, both committed suicide. I'm not sure of the timeline. I'm not sure if they were quite close to when they committed suicide, but that must have been very shocking. It's quite odd for two friends especially to kind of commit suicide in like a friendship group. I'm not sure what the statistics are, but I don't think it's that common. It was said that the flat was always cold and that Pat had to always be wearing a coat inside the house, and she was constantly setting the temperature on her thermostat to 90 degrees Fahrenheit. I'm not sure what that is in Celsius, but I mean, I guess it's quite hot. before giving up her dog to her friend because the dog was terrified, the dog began to act very bizarrely after this tarot reader had cursed the house. And the dog would wake up at 2 a.m. every single night and bark at nothing. The dog would whimper and chew at his fur, and Pat believed he was terrorised by an unseen entity. Every morning, Pat did report that she was wakened up by a song called Mockingbird Hill, and that again, like the other noises she had heard in the house, this was coming from an unidentified source. She could not find the source of this song. And one day, again, while she was sick, she states that she felt an invisible presence while she was in her bathroom. And that must have been terrifying. Like, I always say that when I do these stories, but it's just like just imagine. On the night of June 19th, 1969, Pat had a nightmare where she was walking through a garden of gargoyles, and then they just suddenly attacked. It was at this time that at 4:01 a.m. Pat received the call a few days later. The police had basically asked her who currently resided at her residence, and this phone call was to tell her about her friend Mary Lou. So obviously the nightmare happened on June 19th, and then her friend died just, I think it was like 3 days later. So whether those two are linked, I'm not entirely sure, but it is kind of odd. Another fire inspector said that the burns from the fire made a V shape pointing from the closet to the bed, which was very odd. Like, fires don't just go in that type of shape unless you've kind of poured petroleum on the floor to make it that shape. So like I did say earlier, Ward's legs were burned, but her internal organs did not have any damage at all. And again, there's no cause of death. In 1973, a psychic, I don't know if it was, they were hired at this point, because I don't know if Pat still lived here at this point. But they had photographed the interior of the apartment and told Pat that the entities in the pictures and there was like this horrific odor that was constantly around the house. This was a sign that Pat was in danger. Like I said, Pat did her own research and found a history of deaths, alcoholism, and divorce since the house had been built in 1909. And again, throughout the time Pat had lived there, her best friend had died, her other two friends had died. She had been ill consistently. She nearly died of an accidental overdose. And I think her career began to kind of go down at this point. Her love life wasn't great at this point. So, you know, it's kind of, yeah, that could be the curse, or it could be the house, because the house does have a long history. Pat also found it was built on top of a Russian cemetery, and I think this again was the site of the hangings as well. And Pat did eventually decide to leave the home, and as soon as she did, her success grew again. And she is now the ambassador for peace, and she founded many charities supporting women's rights, climate control, and gun control. So Pat Montandon, from what I know, is still alive. I think she's in her 90s now. But whether it was this curse that this guy had put on her, or whether it was just the house itself, we're not entirely sure. But before the tarot reader had kind of put a curse on the house, Pat had reported that nothing bad had kind of ever really happened to her. She was at the peak of her career. She was mixing with really big celebrities. I think she was happily married. And then in the space of however many months or years, all of those horrible things had happened to her. It's horrible. I wouldn't want to live a life like that. What do you guys think? Do you think it was the curse? Do you think it was just the apartment itself? Do you even believe in spirits? I obviously do. That's why I do this series. So if this is the kind of content you like, definitely hit that subscribe button. I am here every Wednesday for Killer Wednesdays and every Saturday for Saturday